I was 34 when I learned silence can say more than any argument. My name's Alessia Moretti, Captain Army. And that morning I was standing in a funeral home parking lot, adjusting my jacket like it still mattered. It had been 5 years since I'd been back. 5 years since I'd spoken to my sister. Long enough for people to decide who I was without asking me. I checked my phone out of habit, not expectation. No messages, just the schedule. Service at 10. I exhaled, stepped inside, and told myself I was only here to say goodbye. I start earlier than most people would expect. My sister was always louder than me, more visible, the kind of person who filled a room before she even walked into it. Valentina had a way of commanding attention that I never tried to match. She was 4 years older, and from the time I could remember, she set the tone for everything in our house. What we talked about at dinner, who got to speak first, who got praised. I learned early that the path of least resistance was to stay quiet, stay useful, and stay out of her way. That wasn't weakness, it was strategy. I just didn't know it yet. Our father, Marco Moretti, was a quiet man, 72 years old by the time he passed, but even in his 50s and 60s, he moved through life with a kind of deliberate calm that I didn't fully appreciate until I was much older. He never served, but he understood the military mindset better than most veterans I've met. He worked in construction management for 31 years, ran crews, met deadlines, solved problems without raising his voice. He used to say, "You don't need to be the loudest if you're the most consistent." I carried that sentence with me like doctrine. I enlisted at 19, not because I was running from anything, but because I wanted structure that made sense. Home had structure too, but it was Valentina's structure. Her moods, her needs, her timeline. The Army gave me something different. A framework built on merit, not personality. You showed up, you performed, you advanced. Nobody cared if you were charming. Nobody cared if you could fill a room with your presence. They cared if you could do the job. Basic training was at Fort Jackson. I remember the morning we arrived, 04:30. August heat already pressing through the bus windows. The drill sergeant said something I never forgot. He said, "You are not special, but what you do here can be." I held onto that. It became a kind of compass. I wasn't trying to be special. I was trying to be solid. Back then, I was still sending money home, every month like clockwork, covering bills when things got tight, helping Valentina when she said she needed it. She always needed something. A car payment she'd missed. A security deposit for an apartment she swore was temporary. Groceries when she was between jobs, which happened more often than it should have. I never questioned it. She was my sister. That's what you did. You helped, you covered, you absorbed, and I always gave it. Even when my own account was thin. Even when I was eating at the dining facility because I couldn't afford to eat off post. Even when I was working double shifts during training rotations just to keep my head above water. I gave because that was the role I'd been assigned in our family. Valentina was the one who needed. I was the one who provided. Nobody ever asked if I needed anything. When I met Colonel Henry Anderson, I thought I had finally built something for myself. Something that wasn't about obligation or sacrifice or filling someone else's gap. He was 40 at the time, I was 29. We met at a joint operations briefing at Fort Bragg. He was presenting force structure recommendations for a brigade combat team realignment. I was there as a newly promoted first lieutenant, assigned to a logistic support battalion. I wasn't supposed to speak to him directly, but after the briefing, he approached me, asked about a note I'd passed to my commander during the Q&A session, said it was the sharpest observation anyone had made in the room. That was the beginning. Henry respected my service, understood rank structure, understood sacrifice. He'd been in for over 20 years by then. West Point graduate, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, a career built on precision and political awareness. He knew how to move through systems, how to position himself, how to be seen by the right people at the right time. I admired that. I thought it was leadership. At least that's what I believed. Looking back, I see it differently. He respected the idea of me, a disciplined, low-maintenance officer who didn't make waves. Someone who enhanced his image without competing with it. I was a complement to his narrative, not a partner in my own. My sister respected the image of him. The rank, the authority, the uniform with the eagle insignia. She didn't understand what a colonel actually did, but she understood what it represented. Power, status, access. The kind of social currency she'd been chasing her entire life through shortcuts and charm. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I was the only one who thought any of it was real. I believed in the relationship. I believed in the future we discussed, the timeline we sketched out over dinners and phone calls and long weekends when our schedules aligned. I believed Henry when he said he wanted a partner, not a trophy. I believed Valentina when she said she was happy for me. I believed my father when he said, "Just be careful, Alessia. Not everyone shows you who they are right away." He was right, but I wasn't ready to hear it. The engagement came quietly, no grand gesture, just a conversation one evening after a long week, sitting on the porch of his off-post, housing at Fort Hood. He said, "I think we should make this official." I said yes. We picked a date 6 months out. I told my father first. He paused for a long time on the phone, then said, "If he treats you with respect, I support it." I told Valentina second. She screamed, said it was the best news she'd heard all year. Asked about the ring, the venue, the guest list, the dress. She wanted details I hadn't even thought about yet. I should have noticed the difference. My father asked about character, my sister asked about spectacle, but I was too close to see it, too invested, too hopeful. I wanted to believe that after years of giving and serving and staying quiet, I had finally earned something that was just mine. A relationship that wasn't transactional, a future that wasn't borrowed. I was wrong, but I didn't know it yet. Not then, not for several more months, not until the shift began so gradually that by the time I recognized it, the ground had already moved beneath me and I was standing on nothing at all. The signs were there. They were always there. I just wasn't looking for them because I didn't think I had to. I trusted the people closest to me. And that trust, more than anything else, is what made what came next so devastating. Not the betrayal itself. The fact that I never saw it coming. The fact that I had built my sense of safety around people who were already planning to take it apart. But that comes later. For now, I was a first lieutenant with a future. A fiance who called me every evening at 1900 hours. A sister who said she loved me. And a father who watched it all from a distance, already sensing what I couldn't. I was happy, and I had no idea how temporary that happiness was about to become. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does, not when the people involved are smart enough to manage appearances. My sister was many things, but she wasn't careless. She understood timing, she understood angles. She had spent her entire life reading rooms and adjusting herself to fit whatever narrative served her best. So when she started circling Henry, she didn't do it with any obvious aggression. She did it with questions, small ones at first. "What's his rank again?" she asked one afternoon over the phone. I was at my desk on post, reviewing supply chain reports for an upcoming field exercise. I told her, "Colonel, 06. She paused. "And what does that actually mean in terms of authority?" I explained it simply. "A colonel commands brigades, thousands of soldiers, significant operational responsibility, budget authority, influence over career trajectories." She listened more carefully than she'd ever listened to anything I'd said about my own career. At first, I thought she was just curious. Valentina had never shown real interest in the military. She didn't understand the culture, the structure, the weight of what rank actually meant in daily life. I assumed she was trying to connect with my world because I was getting married, trying to understand what my life looked like so she could be part of it. That was generous of me, and naive. Then she started showing up more often when Henry was around, too often for coincidence. She'd suggest dinner when she knew he'd be visiting. She'd call right when we were together, always cheerful, always wanting to chat with both of you. She'd ask Henry directly about his career, his deployments, his future trajectory. She used language that mirrored his, started saying things like command presence and operational tempo, phrases she'd clearly picked up and repurposed to build rapport. Henry didn't discourage it. That was the first thing I should have noticed. Most officers I knew maintained a natural boundary with civilians, especially ones they'd just met. Not coldness, just a professional awareness of where the line was. Henry didn't hold that line with Valentina. He engaged. He'd laugh a little too easily at her jokes, let her interrupt me without correcting it, answer her questions with more detail than they warranted. Once, during a dinner at his place, she asked about his command philosophy, and he talked for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. I was sitting right there, and I might as well have been furniture. Nothing overt, nothing I could point to and say, that right there is the problem. Just imbalance, a slow, steady redistribution of attention that I felt in my chest before I could name it with my brain. Then came the subtle rewriting. She started telling people she introduced us, which wasn't true. We met at a briefing. She wasn't there. She wasn't involved. But she told the story so many times with such confidence that even people who should have known better started repeating it. "Oh, your sister set you two up. That's so sweet." I corrected it once or twice, but Valentina would just laugh and say, "Well, I basically did. I encouraged her to go to that event." Which was also not true. I was assigned to attend. It was a duty requirement. She started referring to Henry as family before anything was official. Before the wedding, before the paperwork. She'd say things like, "When Henry and I were talking the other day," as if they had a separate relationship that existed independently of me. And maybe they did. Maybe by that point they already did. And Henry, he didn't correct her. Not once. Not when she told people she introduced us. Not when she called him family. Not when she started texting him directly about things that had nothing to do with me. Restaurant recommendations. Articles about defense policy she'd clearly Googled just to have something to send him. I found out later she'd been messaging him for weeks before I even noticed the frequency. That's when I felt it for the first time. Not betrayal, not yet. Betrayal requires confirmation. What I felt was displacement, like I was slowly being moved out of my own story. Like the relationship I thought I was building was being redecorated around me without my permission. The furniture was the same, but someone had rearranged it, and I kept bumping into things that used to be where I expected them. I mentioned it once to Henry. Carefully. I said, "Valentina seems very invested in our relationship." He shrugged, said she was just being supportive, said I should be glad my family was so enthusiastic, said I was reading into things. I wanted to believe him. So I did. I told myself I was being paranoid, that years of military vigilance had made me see threats where there were none, that my sister, for all her flaws, wouldn't do something like that. Not to me. Not after everything I'd done for her. The money, the support, the years of covering her mistakes without judgment. Surely that counted for something. Surely there was a floor beneath us that couldn't be broken. There wasn't. But I kept walking on it anyway, pretending it was solid, pretending the cracks I heard beneath my feet were just the house settling. I told myself that love required trust, and trust required letting go of suspicion. I told myself that good sisters don't accuse, good partners don't interrogate, good soldiers don't flinch at shadows. I was wrong about all of it. The shadows were real, the cracks were structural, and the people I trusted most were already standing on the other side of the break, waiting for me to fall through. But I didn't know that yet. Not fully. Not until the night everything collapsed so fast I couldn't even process what had happened before it was already over. I was still holding on to the version of my life that made sense. The version where my sister was difficult but loyal, where my fiance was serious and steady, where my father's silence on the phone was just his way of giving me space. That version was a fiction, and I was about to find out exactly how deep the fiction went. I told myself one more time that everything was fine. It was the last time I would believe that. It happened fast. Too fast to process properly. One week, Henry and I were sitting in his living room reviewing the guest list for the wedding. We'd narrowed it to 87 people. He wanted to keep it tight. I agreed. We talked about the venue, a restored officers' club at Fort Sam, Houston, that a friend of his had recommended. We talked about timelines. He said June. I said September because I had a training rotation that wouldn't end until August. We compromised on late August, Saturday, August 23rd. I remember writing the date in my planner that night like it was already real. 7 days later, everything was gone. The message came on a Tuesday. Not from Henry, from Valentina. "You should hear this from me." I was in my office on post, 09:30 in the morning. I had a logistics review at 1000 hours and a vehicle maintenance inspection after lunch. My phone buzzed and I saw her name and felt something cold move through my stomach before I even read the words. You know that feeling? The one where your body understands what's happening before your mind catches up? The one where your hands go still and your breathing changes and you're already grieving something you haven't been told yet. I remember the exact wording because of how clinical it felt. Not apologetic, not guilty, clinical. Henry and I have connected on a level neither of us expected. I know this is hard, but it just happened. I didn't plan it, neither did he. But we have to be honest with you because you deserve that. I read it 3 times. Each time, the words rearranged themselves into something I kept hoping would mean something different. Connected. Just happened. Honest. Deserve. Every word chosen to make betrayal sound like an accident. Like weather. Like something that occurred outside of anyone's control and therefore outside of anyone's accountability. By the time I reached Henry, the decision was already made. I drove to his quarters after my morning briefing, didn't call ahead, didn't announce myself, just knocked. He opened the door and I could see it in his face immediately. Not guilt, exactly. More like the expression of a man who had already rehearsed this conversation and was relieved to finally deliver it. He didn't deny it, didn't apologize the way I expected. I expected stumbling, shame, the kind of fractured honesty that comes when someone knows they've done something indefensible. Instead, he was composed, almost professional. He framed it like logistics. Things changed, he said. I didn't anticipate it, but I have to be honest about where I am. That was it. That was the explanation. Things changed, as if a 5-year relationship and engagement, a shared future, could be summarized in 2 words and filed away like a closed operational report. I asked him how long. He hesitated. Then he said, "A few months." A few months while we were planning the wedding, while I was adjusting my career timeline to accommodate our future, while I was telling my father that I'd found someone who understood me. I asked him if it mattered that I'd given 5 years of my life to this. He said, "Of course it matters." But the way he said it told me it didn't. Not enough. Not more than whatever Valentina had offered him. No accountability, no hesitation. Just a clean, efficient severance delivered with the same tone he probably used to reassign personnel. I left his quarters at 11:45. I drove back to post. I completed my vehicle inspection at 1300 hours. I signed 4 maintenance reports. I attended a readiness briefing at 1500. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not tell a single person what had happened. And my sister, she moved in with him within weeks. I heard about it through a cousin who thought I already knew. She didn't even wait for the appropriate interval of pretending it was complicated. She just stepped into the space I'd left and filled it like she'd been measuring it for months, which of course she had. The family followed her version of events. My aunt called and said, "Valentina told us you two just grew apart." My cousin said, "Relationships are complicated, Alessia. You can't blame anyone." My uncle said, "Henry seems happy. Maybe it's for the best." Nobody asked me what happened. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody questioned the timeline or the convenience or the fact that my sister had somehow ended up with the man I was engaged to within weeks of the breakup. They just accepted the narrative she gave them. Because that's what Valentina did. She told stories, and people believed them, not because they were true, but because she told them first and told them loudest. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't call anyone to set the record straight. I just left. I requested a transfer within 72 hours. My commanding officer approved it without asking questions. I think he could see it on my face. Not the specifics, but the damage. The kind of stillness that only comes from absorbing something you can't undo. I packed my apartment in 2 days, 11 boxes and a duffel bag. That was everything I owned. 5 years of a relationship, and I walked away with 11 boxes. The last thing I did before I left was call my father. He answered on the second ring. He always did. I didn't tell him the full story. I just said, "I'm transferring. Things didn't work out with Henry." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know." I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't want to. I just said, "I'll call you when I'm settled." He said, "I'll be here." And then I drove away. 9 hours straight, no stops except for fuel. I arrived at my new posting at 2200 hours, checked into temporary billeting, and sat on the edge of a bare mattress in a room that smelled like disinfectant and carpet cleaner. I didn't cry then either. I just sat there, in the dark, listening to the hum of the air conditioning unit, and I let the silence be enough. Because there was nothing left to say. Not to Henry, not to Valentina, not to anyone who had already chosen a side without hearing mine. I was alone. And for the first time, I understood that alone wasn't the worst thing I could be. The worst thing was being surrounded by people who didn't see me. I take the silence. I didn't leave dramatically. There was no confrontation, no scene, no tearful goodbye or bitter accusation thrown across a crowded room. I just processed the paperwork, loaded my car, and reported to a new duty station 400 miles away. Fort Polk, Louisiana. The kind of posting nobody requests unless they're either very ambitious or very broken. I was both, though I didn't realize the second part yet. I transferred into a support battalion that needed a logistics officer, willing to work long hours in conditions that most people considered miserable. The heat alone was enough to filter out anyone who wasn't serious. 100-degree days in the summer, humidity so thick you could feel it in your teeth. The facilities were aging, the resources were stretched, and the operational tempo was relentless. I took it. I wanted to be too busy to think. That's where I met Jeremiah Winston. He wasn't military. He was a civilian contractor working on a communications infrastructure project for the installation. One of several tech firms that had been brought in to upgrade the signal architecture across the training ranges. Most of the contractors kept to themselves. They did their work, filed their reports, and left. Jeremiah was different, but not in any way that drew attention. He didn't ask about rank first. That was the thing I noticed. Everyone I'd met since enlisting introduced themselves through the lens of hierarchy. What's your rank? What's your MOS? Who's your commander? It was natural in the military. It was how we organized the world. But Jeremiah didn't operate that way. The first time we spoke, he asked what my day looked like. Not what I did for a living, not what rank I held. Just, what does your day actually look like from start to finish? I told him. 0500 wake up. PT at 0530, breakfast at 0700. Operations Center by 0800. Meetings, reports, coordination calls, maintenance inspections, supply chain reviews, personnel actions, and then whatever crises dropped into my lap between those fixed points. I usually finished around 1800 hours, sometimes later. He listened, actually listened. Then he said, "That sounds exhausting. What do you do that's just for you?" Nobody had asked me that in years, maybe ever. I didn't have an answer. He didn't push. He just nodded and said, "I think that's something worth figuring out." It was unfamiliar. The attention, the gentleness of it. I didn't trust it at first, not because of him, but because of what I'd just come from. I was used to being valued for what I represented, not who I was. Henry had valued my discipline, my reliability, my willingness to support his trajectory without demanding equal attention. My family had valued my willingness to give without asking for anything in return. Nobody had ever just sat with me and asked what I needed. It felt foreign, almost suspicious. But Jeremiah didn't escalate. He didn't pursue me. He didn't show up with grand gestures or manufactured urgency. He just kept appearing in the ordinary spaces of my day. The dining facility, the motor pool parking lot, the bench outside the operations center where I sometimes sat during the 15-minute gap between my afternoon meetings. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the food, the absurdity of military bureaucracy. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced quietly, like he was testing whether I'd catch it before he committed to the joke. I usually did. That seemed to matter to him. Weeks turned into months. I learned things about him gradually. He'd grown up in Raleigh, North Carolina. His mother was a school teacher. His father worked for the Postal Service for 28 years before retiring. He studied electrical engineering at North Carolina A&T, then got a master's in systems architecture from Georgia Tech. He'd been working in defense-adjacent technology since his mid-20s, building communications platforms for military installations. He didn't talk about his work with any bravado. No name-dropping, no industry jargon designed to impress. He just described problems and how he tried to solve them. Cable roading issues, signal degradation in forested terrain, bandwidth limitations in remote operating environments. He spoke about these things the way a carpenter might talk about joints and load-bearing walls. Practical, grounded, interested in the craft, not the credit. I told him about my career. Not the parts that sounded impressive, but the parts that were true. The long nights, the missed holidays, the weight of being responsible for people who depended on you to get things right, the loneliness of it. He didn't flinch at any of it, didn't try to fix it or romanticize it, just heard it. We built something slowly, no performance, no audience, no strategic positioning or narrative management. Just two people sitting in the quiet margins of their days, learning to trust each other one honest conversation at a time. And for the first time, I realized how much I had been performing before. With Henry, I had always been on, always calibrated, always aware of how I appeared, what I contributed, whether I was meeting some unspoken standard that I could never quite define, but always felt pressure to maintain. With Jeremiah, I was just Alessia, not Captain Moretti, not the reliable one, not the sister who gives. Just a woman sitting on a bench, eating a mediocre sandwich, talking to a man who thought the most important question in the world was whether she had something in her life that was just for her. I fell in love with him the way you fall asleep after weeks of insomnia, not with a jolt, not with fireworks, just a slow, deep exhale followed by the realization that you're finally resting, that the noise has stopped, that the thing you were bracing for isn't coming. He told me later that he felt the same way, that he'd noticed me before I noticed him, that he'd seen something in the way I carried myself, not the rank, not the uniform, but something underneath. A steadiness that he recognized because he carried it too. We didn't rush, we didn't announce, we didn't perform, we just chose each other, quietly, repeatedly, in the small moments that no one else was watching. And that, I would learn, was the only foundation that held. I made a decision without announcing it. That was the cleanest break I could manage at the time. I stopped engaging with the network of information that had kept me tethered to my old life. No more phone calls with cousins who filtered everything through Valentina's version. No more responding to texts from aunts who wanted to update me on how wonderful Henry and Valentina looked together at some event I hadn't been invited to. No more checking social media pages where my sister posted photographs of herself at military functions, wearing cocktail dresses and standing next to a man in dress blues who used to stand next to me. I stopped responding to family updates filtered through my sister, and I stopped explaining myself to people who hadn't asked for my side of the story when it mattered. They filled in the silence however they wanted. I heard fragments over the years, through the one cousin who still called me directly, a quiet woman named Rosa, who had always been more observer than participant in the family. She told me what people said, that I was bitter, that I couldn't handle rejection, that I'd run away instead of dealing with things like an adult, that I was selfish for not coming home for holidays, that I'd abandoned my father. That last one stung, because it wasn't true. I called my father every Sunday at 1700 hours. Without fail. For 5 years. He never mentioned what the rest of the family said about me, and I never asked. We talked about his garden, his health, the books he was reading, the neighbors. Small, steady, ordinary things. He was the one thread I refused to cut, even when everything else had been severed. Meanwhile, I focused on my career. After Fort Polk, I moved to Fort Campbell, then a staff assignment at the Pentagon, then a command position back at Fort Bragg, which had been redesignated as Fort Liberty by then. Each move was deliberate, each step built on the one before it. No shortcuts, no visibility plays, no leveraging personal relationships for professional gain, just consistency, just showing up every day and doing the work that was in front of me until someone noticed that I'd been doing it longer and better than most. I progressed steadily through the ranks. First Lieutenant to Captain, Captain Alessia Moretti, 03, United States Army. Earned everything the long way. Every evaluation, every board review, every selection cycle. I earned my place not because I was extraordinary, but because I was relentless in the most ordinary way possible. Jeremiah built something too, quietly. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he was building. I knew he'd left the contracting firm he'd been with when we met. I knew he'd started his own company. I knew it had something to do with secure communications technology for defense applications. He talked about it in the same understated way he talked about everything. No press releases, no investor pitches rehearsed at the dinner table. He just worked. Some nights he'd be at his desk until 2300 hours, writing proposals or reviewing engineering specifications. I'd bring him coffee, and he'd look up with this expression that was half gratitude and half apology, like he was sorry for being absorbed, but couldn't stop. I understood that look. I'd worn it myself 1,000 times. His company grew, first 3 employees, then 12, then 30. Each milestone arrived without fanfare. He didn't celebrate closings or contracts the way other entrepreneurs I'd met did. He'd mention it at dinner like it was a weather report. "We got the Phase 2 award today," The DoD contract came through. We're hiring another engineering team. I didn't grasp the scale. Not then. I was focused on my own work, my own command responsibilities, my own trajectory. I knew his company was doing well. I knew it was growing. But defense contracting was full of small firms doing capable work. I assumed his was one of many. It wasn't, but I wouldn't fully understand that until much later. Until a room full of people at my father's funeral looked at him and saw something I'd married long before it had a name or a valuation or a headline. The consequences of the choices we all made 5 years earlier didn't show up immediately. They built, slowly, brick by brick, decision by decision, my career ascending through discipline, his company expanding through innovation, and somewhere, 400 miles away, my sister and Henry Anderson living a life that looked perfect from the outside and was quietly disintegrating from within. But I didn't know that yet. And I wouldn't have taken satisfaction from it even if I had. I wasn't tracking their trajectory. I wasn't comparing timelines. I was just living, building, moving forward. The consequences were building for all of us. And they were about to arrive at the same place, on the same day, in the same room. 5 years changes trajectories. That's not philosophy. That's arithmetic. 5 years of consistent effort in one direction will take you somewhere measurably different from where you started. 5 years of poor decisions, denial, and surface-level maintenance will do the same, just in the opposite direction. Mine stabilized. Theirs didn't. From what I heard indirectly through Rosa and through the quiet network of military acquaintances who still orbited my professional world, Henry's career had plateaued. Colonel, 06, no advancement. He'd been passed over for brigadier general twice. The first time it could be attributed to timing. The second time it was a pattern. His evaluation reports were technically strong but lacked the command endorsements that signaled genuine confidence from senior leadership. Too many lateral moves, not enough command traction. He'd been shuffled between staff positions that looked important on paper but were functionally parking spots for officers the Army wasn't sure what to do with. I understood what that meant because I lived inside the same system. Being passed over once was survivable. Being passed over twice was a message. The Army was telling him, without saying it directly, that he had reached his ceiling, that the stars he wanted were never coming, that his career, while respectable, was finished in any meaningful sense. Valentina adjusted the way she always did, by spending, by presenting, by maintaining the image long after the structure underneath started cracking. She redecorated their quarters at Fort Belvoir twice in 18 months. She hosted events that they couldn't afford, inviting people who were already pulling away. She posted photographs online with captions about the colonel life that read like advertisements for something no one was buying anymore. Debt followed, credit cards first. Then a second mortgage on a property they'd purchased outside Fredericksburg that was supposed to be an investment, but became a weight. Then the quiet borrowing, the kind that happens between people who don't want to admit they're struggling. Small loans from friends that were never repaid. Deferred payments, late notices. Reputation shifted, quietly at first. An officer's reputation is a living document. It exists in conversations you're not part of, in assessments written behind closed doors, in the way people pause before recommending you for something. Henry's reputation had been built on competence and confidence. But competence without advancement creates a specific kind of vulnerability. People start to wonder what the gap means, what they're not seeing, what's being concealed. Then, more visibly. I heard through a colleague at the Pentagon that Henry had been counseled for a sharp exchange with a subordinate during a staff meeting. Not a career-ending event, but a crack in the facade. Officers who are secure don't snap at majors during briefings. Officers who are drowning do. My sister tried to control the narrative, as she always had. She told people they were in transition, that Henry was being selective about his next assignment, that they were exploring options, the language of someone who has lost control but hasn't accepted it yet. I didn't intervene, not out of bitterness. I want to be clear about that. Bitterness requires emotional investment, and I had divested from their story completely. I didn't wish them harm. I didn't celebrate their struggles. I simply wasn't watching. The information came to me passively, through channels I hadn't sought out, and I received it the way you receive a weather report about a city you no longer live in. Noted, filed, not acted upon. Just distance. Distance was the most honest thing I could offer. Distance was the boundary I had set when I drove away from Fort Hood 5 years earlier, and I maintained it not as punishment, but as protection. For me, for the life I had built, for the marriage that had become the most important thing I'd ever been part of. I couldn't protect any of that if I was still tangled in the wreckage of what came before. So I let them struggle without witnessing it. I let the consequences arrive without commentary. I let 5 years do what 5 years does when the foundation is flawed. Erode, crack, settle, and eventually reveal what was always underneath. Meanwhile, my own life continued to build. Jeremiah's company had crossed a threshold I hadn't fully registered. What started as a small defense tech firm had grown into something with national visibility, contracts with 3 branches of the military, a secure communications platform adopted by Special Operations Command, a partnership with a major aerospace corporation. His name appeared in trade publications I didn't read and on panels at conferences I didn't attend. He never once used his success to leverage social capital, never once introduced himself with his title or his net worth. When we attended events together, he'd say, "I work in tech, defense stuff," and leave it at that. People who knew would recognize the understatement. People who didn't would move on. I loved that about him. I loved that his power was invisible until it wasn't. That he carried influence the way my father carried wisdom, quietly, without display, only revealed when the moment required it. We were steady. We were solid. We were real. And we were about to walk into a room where none of that was expected. There wasn't a reconciliation. I want to be precise about that because people often assume that time creates one automatically, that enough years pass and the wound closes and you find yourself ready to forgive. That's not how it works. Not for me. Time didn't soften what happened. It clarified it. The further I got from the betrayal, the more clearly I could see its architecture, the planning, the patience of it, the way my sister had positioned herself over months, not days, the way Henry had let it happen by degrees, never committing to the affair in a single dramatic moment, but drifting toward it in a series of small, deniable choices. Time gave me clarity. It didn't give me closure. And then, after years of silence, a message arrived from Valentina. Not an apology. That would have required an admission. More like a probe, a test of the perimeter, the kind of message someone sends when they want to know if the defenses are still up without actually exposing themselves to fire. "Maybe we should talk. It's been a long time. I think about you." I read it once. Sitting at my desk at home, a Saturday afternoon, Jeremiah was in the next room working on a proposal. The house was quiet. The message sat on my screen like an unexploded device, and I treated it the same way I'd been trained to treat anything potentially dangerous. Assess, evaluate, decide. I didn't respond, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish her, but because there was nothing to rebuild, not without truth, and she still wasn't offering that. The message contained no acknowledgement of what she'd done, no ownership, no specificity, just a vague gesture toward reconnection that assumed I'd been waiting for it. That assumed the door was still there, just closed, not removed entirely. She didn't understand that the door was gone, that the wall had been reframed, that the architecture of my life no longer included an entrance point for someone who had never acknowledged the damage they'd caused. I thought about writing back. Briefly, I drafted 3 different responses in my head, none of which I committed to paper. The first was confrontational, the second was clinical, the third was compassionate. None of them felt right because all of them assumed that a single message could bridge a gap that had been widening for 5 years. It couldn't. Instead, I focused on what was real. My marriage, my work, the few relationships that had remained consistent, Rosa, who still called monthly, my father, who I still spoke with every Sunday, a handful of fellow officers who had known me long enough to understand what loyalty actually looked like. Jeremiah noticed the shift in my mood that evening. He didn't press, he just sat beside me on the couch and asked, "Anything I can do?" I told him about the message. He listened without reacting. Then he said, "What do you need from me right now?" Not advice, not analysis, just availability. I said, "Nothing, just this." And that was enough. Trust, I realized, isn't rebuilt through time. That's the myth people tell themselves because it's convenient. It makes betrayal seem like a temporary condition that naturally heals if you're patient enough. It doesn't. Trust is rebuilt through accountability, through specific, uncomfortable, voluntary truth-telling that costs the person something, through action that matches the scale of the damage. And there was none of that in Valentina's message. No accountability, no truth, no cost. Just 5 words that assumed the passage of time had done the work that she refused to do herself. I deleted the message a week later. Not in a moment of anger or resolve, just during a routine cleanup of my inbox. It sat there for 7 days alongside promotional emails and meeting confirmations, and then I moved it to the trash with the same mechanical efficiency I applied to everything in my life that no longer served a purpose. My father died 3 months after that message. A stroke, sudden, in his sleep. Rosa called me at 06:15 on a Thursday morning. I was already awake, getting ready for PT. She was crying before she even spoke. I knew before she said the words. He was 72. He'd been healthy enough, or so I'd thought. Our last conversation had been 4 days earlier, the usual Sunday call. He talked about his tomato plants, said the weather had been good for them, said he was thinking about repainting the kitchen. I told him about a training exercise I was overseeing the following week. He'd said, "Be safe, Alessia." That was the last thing my father ever said to me. I arranged emergency leave within hours. Jeremiah cleared his schedule without hesitation. We drove together, 12 hours through the night, arriving at my father's house just before dawn. The house was already occupied by cousins and neighbors, and the slow machinery of grief that activates when someone dies in a small community. The funeral was set for 3 days later, and I knew with absolute certainty that Valentina would be there, that the silence was about to break, that the room I had spent 5 years carefully avoiding was about to contain everyone I had left behind. I wasn't afraid, but I wasn't ready either. There's a space between those two things, a kind of steady unease that doesn't paralyze you, but doesn't let you rest. I occupied that space for 3 days, preparing, processing, grieving a father who had been my anchor in ways I was only beginning to fully understand. Jeremiah stayed close, not hovering, just present, the way he always was. And we waited. The funeral brought everything back into the same room. Literally. St. Catherine's, the church my father had attended for 40 years. Small, brick, with stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews in the late morning. I hadn't been inside since I was 23, the year I commissioned as an officer. My father had been there that day too, sitting in the 3rd row, watching me take the oath. He hadn't cried, but his jaw was tight the way it got when he was trying to hold something in. Now his casket sat at the front of the church, draped in flowers my cousins had arranged. White lilies. His favorite. I knew because he'd mentioned them once, years ago, casually. The way he mentioned everything that mattered, without emphasis, trusting that the people who loved him would remember. I sat in the 2nd row, Jeremiah beside me. He wore a tailored navy suit, no tie, which was unusual for him, but appropriate for the setting. He looked like what he was, a man who carried weight without advertising it. Quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need a nameplate. I wore my dress uniform, not for show, because my father would have wanted that. He'd always been proud of my service, even when the rest of the family treated it like a curiosity or an excuse for my absence. The church filled slowly. Relatives I hadn't seen in years, neighbors, friends of my father from his construction days, people who knew him as Marco, the man who built things that lasted. And then Valentina walked in. I hadn't seen my sister in 5 years. 5 years of silence, distance, and careful absence. And yet nothing about her had changed on the surface. Still composed, still confident, hair done perfectly, makeup precise, dressed in black, but the kind of black that was more about appearance than mourning. A fitted dress, heels, jewelry that caught the light. She entered the church the way she entered every room, expecting to be noticed. She was alone. Henry wasn't with her, which I noted but didn't analyze in the moment. His absence was a data point I would understand later. She wore Henry's silver eagle pin on her lapel. The colonel's insignia. Not hers, not earned. Borrowed authority, pinned to her chest like a medal she'd awarded herself. I saw it from 20 feet away, and I understood what it meant. It meant she was still performing. still defining herself through proximity to rank she didn't hold and hadn't earned. She saw me before I saw her. I know this because when I looked up, she was already walking toward me with that particular expression she wore when she had a script prepared. Not grief, not discomfort, certainty, the face of someone who had already decided how this interaction would go. She stopped in the aisle beside my pew, close enough that the people around us could hear, which was the point. "Alessia," she said, loud enough, measured. "I'm so sorry about Dad." I nodded. "Thank you." She let a beat pass, then with a slight tilt of her head, she said, "Poor you. Still single, still struggling. You know, I always hoped you'd find someone, but I guess the army doesn't leave much room for a personal life." She said it with manufactured sympathy, the tone of someone offering condolences for a life she assumed was lesser than her own. She hadn't updated her understanding of who I was. In her mind, I was still the younger sister who'd been left behind, still enlisted, still alone, still defined by what she had taken from me. I didn't correct her, not immediately. I let the words land, let the people around us absorb them. Then I said simply, "Have you met my husband?" She blinked, just once. A micro-expression that told me the word husband hadn't been in her script. Jeremiah stood from the pew beside me. He'd been sitting quietly, head slightly bowed, the way you do in a church before a funeral. When he rose to his full height, 6'2", broad-shouldered, in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, the air in the room shifted. He extended his hand to Valentina. "Jeremiah Winston," he said, calm, polite, no edge. She took his hand automatically, the way you do when someone offers. And then I watched her face change. She recognized him, not from me, not from our family, from the news, from the tech publications, from the defense industry coverage, from the profile that had run 6 months earlier in a national magazine about the youngest defense tech founders reshaping Pentagon contracting. His face had been on the cover. Her hand went slack in his. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes moved from his face to mine and back again, trying to reconcile the Alessia she'd left behind with the Alessia standing in front of her, the one married to a man whose company was valued at a figure she couldn't even contextualize. For the first time, she didn't have control of the narrative. I didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't deliver a line. I just stood there, beside my husband, in front of my father's casket, and let the truth speak for itself. Valentina opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then she said, "I didn't know," in a voice so quiet it barely carried. "No," I said. "You didn't." She walked away, sat on the opposite side of the church, alone. But the real shift hadn't happened yet, because the will hadn't been read, and I didn't yet know what my father had uncovered, what he had known, what he had documented, what he had been holding for years, waiting for the moment when the truth could finally stand without anyone to rewrite it. That moment was coming, and it was going to change everything. The will changed everything. Not because of the assets. My father was not a wealthy man in the way the world measures wealth. He had the house, paid off over 30 years of careful management, a piece of land outside town, 6 acres, that had been in the family since my grandparents bought it in 1968, a savings account, a small investment portfolio managed by a local advisor he'd trusted since the 1990s, modest by any standard, but meaningful. The reading took place 2 days after the funeral. My father's attorney, a man named Philip Barone, who had known our family for decades, arranged it at his office downtown, a small conference room with wood paneling and a window that overlooked the parking lot. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. I was there. Valentina was there. Rosa came as a witness. Jeremiah waited in the car at my request, not because I was ashamed or uncertain, but because this was family business, and I wanted to face it without anyone interpreting his presence as a statement. Philip read the preliminary sections first. Standard legal language, estate identification, executor appointment. He'd named me as executor, which I hadn't known. That alone shifted the temperature in the room. Valentina straightened in her chair. Her jaw tightened. She looked at Philip as if expecting him to correct a mistake. Then came the bequests. The house, to me, the land, to me, the savings accounts, to me, the investment portfolio, to me, everything. Every single asset my father had accumulated over 72 years of living, working, building, and saving. all of it directed to one person. Me. Valentina stared at the table. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "That's not possible. He wouldn't do that." Philip didn't argue. He simply turned to the next section of the document. And that's when the truth came out. My father had included a personal addendum, handwritten, dated 18 months before his death. Philip read it aloud, slowly, as my father had requested. "To my daughters," it began, "I have spent the last years of my life understanding something I should have seen sooner." He documented everything, the letters. My father had discovered that Valentina had intercepted correspondence between me and other family members during the period after my transfer. Birthday cards I'd sent that were never delivered, holiday messages that were rerouted, invitations I'd extended that were declined on my behalf without my knowledge. She had systematically cut the lines of communication between me and the family, then told everyone I'd gone silent by choice. The lies. He documented conversations he'd overheard or been told about secondhand, in which Valentina had misrepresented my situation, telling people I'd been demoted, that I'd had a breakdown, that I was financially unstable, that I was bitter and unwell. None of it true. All of it designed to ensure that the family's sympathy stayed with her and the narrative she'd constructed. The isolation. He documented the pattern. How Valentina had positioned herself as the family's central point of contact after I left. How she controlled information flow. How she decided who knew what and when. How she used access to my father as leverage, visiting him regularly, but always framing those visits as evidence of her devotion while implying my absence was abandonment. He wrote, "Valentina did not steal a man from Alessia. She stole a family. She stole the trust of people who should have known better, including me, for too long." He wrote, "I did not confront this while I was alive because I was afraid of losing both daughters. That was my failure. I will not let it be my legacy." He wrote, "Everything I leave goes to Alessia, not as a reward, as a correction. For the years she was faithful to a family that was deceived into forgetting her." The room went quiet in a way I've only heard in briefings when something irreversible is announced, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on your chest and holds you still. Valentina didn't argue, because for once there was nothing she could rewrite. The evidence was in my father's handwriting. His dates matched timelines that could be verified. His observations were specific, detailed, and devastating in their calm precision. He'd written it the way he'd lived his life, methodically, honestly, without excess. She sat there, staring at the table, and for the first time in my life, I saw my sister without a performance. Without a script, without an angle, just a woman sitting in a room where the truth had finally arrived and there was no door left to escape through. I didn't say anything to her. Didn't need to. There was no speech that would improve this moment. No declaration that would add to what my father had already said. He had spoken for me. From beyond his life, he had reached back and set the record straight with a thoroughness and a tenderness that I hadn't known he possessed. I said goodbye to my father, silently, in that room, with his words still hanging in the air like a final order. And then I left, with Jeremiah. Not because of what he built, not because of his company or his wealth or the recognition that had followed him into that church and rewritten my sister's assumptions in an instant, but because of how he stood beside me before any of it existed. Because he had asked me what my day looked like when I had nothing. Because he had sat with me on a bench at Fort Polk and treated my exhaustion like it mattered. Because he had never once needed me to be more than I was. And that's what stayed with me as we drove away from my father's house for the last time. Not the inheritance, not the confrontation, not the look on Valentina's face when the will was read. What stayed was the quiet, the steady, reliable quiet of a man who had chosen me when I was broke and broken and starting over in a place nobody wanted to be. Who had built his life alongside mine without ever once making me feel like I owed him for it. I didn't lose anything 5 years ago. I thought I did. I grieved it. I carried the weight of it. But what I actually lost was a life that wasn't meant for me. A man who loved the idea of me more than the reality. A sister who saw me as a resource, not a person. A family dynamic that required my silence and my sacrifice to function. I lost something hollow. And I gained something real. And if you've ever been replaced, rewritten, or underestimated, if you've ever watched someone take credit for your absence or fill a space you were pushed out of, just understand this. You're not falling behind. You're being redirected somewhere they were never meant to follow. The people who replaced you will spend their lives maintaining a version of events that requires your invisibility to survive. And one day, the truth will walk into the room in a tailored suit, extend its hand, and introduce itself. And they won't have a single thing to say. If this story stayed with you, take a second to reflect on your own life. Have you ever been replaced, misunderstood, or quietly pushed out of something you gave everything to? And if you have, did it break you or did it redirect you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more than you think. And if you believe in choosing peace over proving a point, stick around. There's more stories like this coming.